On a quiet Tuesday evening, the sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the small town. Lieutenant General Marcus Caldwell, a man whose presence commanded respect even in civilian clothes, was driving home, after attending an awards ceremony held in his honor. The event had been filled with speeches celebrating his years of service and dedication to the nation. But now, as he navigated the familiar streets of his hometown, all he wanted was to get back to his family and unwind. The car ride was peaceful, the hum of the engine blending with the soft music playing on the radio. Caldwell rolled down his window slightly, letting the cool evening breeze brush against his face. He felt content, proud of what he had achieved, but also grounded by the knowledge that there was still work to be done. As he passed by a gas station, he noticed his fuel gauge was nearing empty. Though he wasn't far from home, he decided it wouldn't hurt to fill up. Better safe than sorry, he thought to himself with a small smile. Pulling into the brightly lit gas station, Caldwell parked at one of the pumps. He stepped out of his car, stretching his legs after the long drive. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and fresh asphalt, and the sound of distant chatter from other customers created a comforting sense of normalcy. After filling up the tank, he walked inside the convenience store to pay. The cashier greeted him warmly, exchanging pleasantries as he handed over the cash. It was a simple moment, unremarkable in every way. But little did Caldwell know, this ordinary pit stop would soon lead to something extraordinary. As Caldwell returned to his car, he glanced at his watch. It was getting late, and he knew his wife would have dinner waiting for him. He climbed back into the driver's seat, turned the key in the ignition, and pulled out of the gas station parking lot. The road ahead was dimly lit, lined with trees, swaying gently in the breeze. Everything seemed calm, almost serene. But then, without warning, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. His heart skipped a beat as he eased his car to the side of the road. At first, Caldwell assumed it must be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe he hadn't signaled properly when leaving the gas station, or perhaps his license plate light needed replacing. Things like that happened all the time. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. Rolling down his window, he rested his hands on the steering wheel, ready to cooperate fully. A police officer approached his vehicle, flashlight in hand, shining the beam directly into Caldwell's eyes. "Good evening, sir," the officer said gruffly. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Caldwell squinted against the bright light, trying to make out the officer's face. "No, sir, I don't," he replied politely. "Is everything okay?" The officer shone the flashlight lower, illuminating Caldwell's features. For a brief moment there was silence. Then the officer spoke again, his tone noticeably colder. "You've got a broken taillight. Didn't you notice it before getting on the road?" Caldwell frowned slightly, surprised by the accusation. He made a mental note to check his car later. It wasn't impossible after all. But for now, he simply nodded. "I'm sorry about that, officer. I'll get it fixed as soon as possible." But instead of moving on to issue a warning or ticket, the officer lingered, studying Caldwell intently. There was something unsettling about the way he stared, as if sizing him up. Caldwell shifted slightly in his seat, unsure of what to make of the situation. He'd been pulled over many times before during his decades of service, especially when traveling through different states, but those encounters had always been professional and respectful. This felt different. The officer leaned closer, resting, one hand on the roof of Caldwell's car while the other hovered near his belt. "License and registration, please," he demanded curtly. Caldwell complied immediately, retrieving the documents from his glove compartment and handing them over. As the officer examined them under the glow of his flashlight, Caldwell couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. For a few moments, the only sounds were the rustling leaves overhead and the occasional passing car in the distance. Caldwell waited patiently, maintaining eye contact whenever the officer glanced his way. Finally, the officer straightened up, holding the documents tightly in his hand. Instead of returning to his patrol car to run the information, however, He stood there staring at Caldwell as though deciding what to do next. And then, without warning, his demeanor changed completely. His voice hardened, taking on an edge that sent a chill down Caldwell's spine. "You people always think you can break the rules and get away with it, don't you?" He spat, his words laced with disdain. Caldwell blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. Before he could respond, the officer continued, his tone dripping with hostility. "Don't play dumb with me, you know exactly what I'm talking about." Caldwell's mind raced. What was happening? He had done nothing wrong, yet the officer's words painted him as guilty of some invisible crime. Determined to defuse the situation, he kept his voice steady. "Officer, I assure you I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I'm just trying to understand what's going on here." But the officer didn't seem interested in listening. If anything, Caldwell's calm response only seemed to infuriate him further. He stepped back, reaching for his holster. Caldwell's pulse quickened as he watched the officer's hand move toward his weapon. Was this really happening? In broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, was this man actually escalating the situation? And then, in a move that left Caldwell stunned, the officer drew his gun, pointing it squarely at Caldwell's chest. Time seemed to slow as Caldwell processed what was unfolding. His military training kicked in, urging him to remain composed, despite the fear coursing through him. He raised his hands slightly higher, ensuring they remained visible. "Officer, please," he said, his voice firm but measured. "I'm unarmed. Let's talk about this." But the officer wasn't listening. His earlier claim about a broken taillight no longer mattered. It was clear now that this confrontation wasn't about traffic violations. Something deeper, darker, was at play. And as the seconds ticked by, Caldwell realized that his life might depend on how carefully he navigated the next few moments. As the officer's gun remained pointed at Lieutenant General Marcus Caldwell, the air between them grew heavier with each passing second. The once quiet street now felt like a stage for something far more sinister than a routine traffic stop. Caldwell's mind raced, trying to piece together what had gone so horribly wrong in such a short amount of time. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made any sudden movements, and yet here he was, staring down the barrel of a weapon, his life hanging precariously in the balance. The officer's face twisted into a sneer, his earlier pretense of professionalism completely abandoned. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he barked, his voice cutting through the stillness of the evening. Caldwell blinked, confused by the accusation. Better? What did that even mean? He hadn't said or done anything to provoke such hostility. But it was clear now that this wasn't about rules or regulations. It was personal. Caldwell swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the cool night breeze coming through the open window. He knew better than to argue or retaliate. Instead, he spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Officer, I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm just a civilian following your instructions. Can we please resolve this peacefully?" But his attempt at reason only seemed to fuel the officer's anger. "Don't give me that civilian nonsense," the man snapped, taking a step closer to the car. His grip on the gun tightened, and Caldwell instinctively tensed, though he kept his hands firmly planted on the steering wheel. "We both know who you are, or at least who you claim to be." Caldwell frowned, unsure how to respond. Claim to be? Did the officer somehow doubt his identity? It didn't make sense. Still, he decided to clarify. "Sir, I'm Lieutenant General Marcus Caldwell," he explained patiently. "I've served in the U.S. Army for over 20 years. I have my credentials right here if you'd like to verify them." For a moment there was silence. The officer stared at Caldwell, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, right," he scoffed. "Another one of you thinking you can throw around titles and expect special treatment. Save it for someone who cares." Caldwell felt a pang of frustration, but he quickly pushed it aside. Losing his temper wouldn't help. He needed to stay focused. He glanced toward the gas station parking lot, hoping someone might notice what was happening. Sure enough, a few people were standing near their cars, watching the scene unfold. Some looked concerned, Others appeared frozen in shock. Caldwell realized they might be his only hope of de-escalating the situation. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job," Caldwell continued, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside him. "But this isn't necessary. I haven't done anything wrong. Let's take a step back and figure this out together." The officer ignored him, stepping even closer until he was practically leaning into the car. His eyes narrowed as he glared at Caldwell, his breathing heavy and uneven. "You people always act like you're untouchable," he growled. "Like you're above the law. Well, guess what? Not tonight." Caldwell's heart sank. "You people." The phrase hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't subtle, it was clear. The officer's behavior wasn't driven by any legitimate concern for safety or protocol. This was about prejudice, plain and simple. Caldwell had faced discrimination before during his career, but never had it escalated to this level. Never had he been threatened with violence simply because of the color of his skin. Despite the rising tension, Caldwell refused to let his emotions get the better of him. He drew upon years of training in leadership and crisis management, reminding himself that staying composed was key. "Officer, I respect your authority," he said, his voice unwavering. "But pointing a gun at an unarmed citizen isn't going to solve anything. Please lower your weapon and let's talk this through." Instead of responding, the officer tightened his grip on the gun, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. Caldwell's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain still. Any sudden movement could set the man off, and he couldn't afford to take that risk. He glanced again toward the gas station, where more people had gathered. Some were recording the incident on their phones, while others were calling emergency services. Caldwell silently thanked them, knowing their presence might be the only thing keeping the situation from spiraling further out of control. "You hear me talking, don't you?" the officer snarled, his voice rising. "Or are you too busy feeling sorry for yourself? Thinking you're some big shot because of those medals and uniforms?" Caldwell clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to defend himself. He wanted to explain that his accomplishments weren't about ego. They were about service, sacrifice, and duty. But he knew arguing would only worsen things. Instead, he focused on maintaining eye contact, showing the officer that he wasn't backing down, not out of defiance but out of determination to survive this ordeal with dignity intact. By now, the crowd at the gas station had grown larger. A few brave individuals stepped forward, shouting at the officer to put his gun away. "What are you doing? He hasn't done anything," one woman yelled, her voice trembling with outrage. Another man added, "This is insane. Call someone. Higher up." The officer hesitated, glancing briefly over his shoulder at the growing commotion. For a split second, Caldwell thought he might relent, lowering his weapon and stepping back. But instead, he turned his fury toward the bystanders. "Stay out of this," he shouted, waving the gun in their direction. "This doesn't concern you." The crowd fell silent, though their eyes remained fixed on the scene. Caldwell could see the fear in their expressions, the uncertainty of what might happen next. He realized then that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. If he gave in to despair now, it would send a message that such behavior was acceptable. And he couldn't let that happen. Summoning every ounce of courage, Caldwell addressed the officer one last time. "Sir, I'm asking you to reconsider this course of action," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "There are witnesses here, cameras rolling. Whatever issues you have, they can be resolved without resorting to violence. Please do the right thing." For a long moment, the officer didn't respond. He stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes locked onto Caldwell's. Then finally, he lowered the gun slightly, though he didn't holster it entirely. "Fine," he muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. "But don't think this is over." With that, he retreated to his patrol car, slamming the door shut behind him. Caldwell exhaled deeply, the weight of the encounter crashing down on him all at once. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, and he realized just how close he had come to disaster. But even as relief washed over him, he knew this was far from the end. The footage recorded by the bystanders, the calls to emergency services, the questions swirling in his mind, all of it pointed to one undeniable, Truth. Justice needed to be served. As the patrol car sped away, leaving skid marks on the asphalt, Caldwell sat in stunned silence. The peaceful evening he had envisioned was shattered, replaced by a stark reminder of the challenges that still plagued society. Yet amidst the chaos, he found a spark of resolve. This wasn't just his story. It was a call to action, a demand for change, and he vowed to answer it no matter what it took. The moments after the officer's departure felt surreal to Lieutenant General Marcus Caldwell. Though the immediate threat had passed, the weight of what had just transpired settled heavily on his shoulders. His hands were still trembling as he gripped the steering wheel, and his mind raced with a mix of emotions: relief, anger, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of disbelief. How could such a routine evening spiral into something so harrowing? He glanced at the gas station parking lot, where the small crowd of witnesses lingered, some still filming or talking amongst themselves. Their presence had likely saved him from an even worse fate, but now they stood silently, unsure of what to do next. Caldwell knew he couldn't stay frozen in that moment. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to focus. First, he needed to ensure his safety. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "This is Lieutenant General Marcus Caldwell," he said clearly when the operator answered. "I've just been involved in an altercation with a police officer who pointed a firearm at me during what should have been a routine traffic stop. I need someone to come document this incident." The operator sounded surprised but professional, assuring Caldwell that help was on the way. As he hung up, he noticed a few people approaching his car cautiously. One of them was a middle-aged woman holding her phone, which displayed the video she'd recorded of the encounter. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked softly. "That was terrifying." Caldwell nodded, offering her a weak smile. "Thank you for recording it," he said. "And thank you for speaking up. That took courage." The woman shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, thank you for staying calm. If you hadn't handled it the way you did..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Other witnesses joined in, sharing their accounts of what they'd seen. Some expressed outrage, others offered support, and a few simply stood there, visibly shaken. Caldwell listened intently, grateful for their solidarity, but also keenly aware of the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about exposing the truth and holding the officer accountable. He thanked everyone for their bravery and encouraged them to share their videos and statements with the authorities when they arrived. As the minutes ticked by, the flashing lights of multiple police cars and emergency vehicles illuminated the scene. Officers poured out of their vehicles, some looking bewildered, others exchanging uneasy glances. When they approached Caldwell's car, he rolled down his window once again, bracing himself for yet another interaction with law enforcement. But this time the tone was different. The lead investigator introduced himself respectfully, acknowledging Caldwell's rank and expressing concern about the reported incident. "I'm sorry you had to go through this, sir," the investigator said earnestly. "We're going to take your statement and gather all available evidence. Can you tell us exactly what happened?" Caldwell recounted the events as calmly and thoroughly as possible, leaving out no detail. He described how the initial stop had escalated without provocation, how the officer had hurled insults and accusations, and how the situation had devolved into a life-threatening confrontation. As he spoke, the investigator scribbled notes furiously, occasionally pausing to ask clarifying questions. Other officers fanned out around the area, collecting witness statements and securing the recordings taken by bystanders. Throughout the process, Caldwell remained composed, drawing strength from years of leadership experience. He understood the importance of staying factual and unemotional, even though every word brought back vivid memories of the fear he'd felt earlier. Still, he couldn't help but notice the tension among the responding officers. Some seemed genuinely disturbed by the allegations, while others appeared defensive, almost as if they were preparing for backlash. It was a stark reminder of the broader issues at play. Not just one rogue officer, but systemic problems that allowed such behavior to occur in the first place. Once the investigators finished gathering information, they assured Caldwell that the case would be prioritized and investigated thoroughly. They promised to keep him updated on any developments, though Caldwell wasn't naive enough to believe everything would fall neatly into place. He knew how these situations often played out, promises made, investigations dragged out, and ultimately little accountability delivered. But tonight something felt different. The sheer number of witnesses, combined with the undeniable evidence captured on camera, gave him hope that justice might actually prevail. After the authorities left, Caldwell finally allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. He leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes as exhaustion washed over him. His wife's face flashed in his mind. How would he explain this to her? She worried about him constantly, especially given the nature of his work. Telling her about this encounter would only add to her stress. Yet he knew he couldn't hide it. Honesty was too important in their relationship. Driving home, Caldwell replayed the night's events in his mind, analyzing every decision he'd made. Had he said the right things? Could he have de-escalated the situation more effectively? These questions swirled in his head, but he eventually reminded himself that none of this was his fault. The officer's actions were rooted in prejudice, not logic or reason. No amount of politeness or compliance could have changed that reality. When he pulled into his driveway, his wife was waiting for him on the porch, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. The look on her face told him she already suspected something was wrong. "Marcus," she said, rushing toward him as he stepped out of the car. "What happened? You're late, and I've been calling." Caldwell sighed, pulling her into a tight embrace. "It's a long story," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. "Let's go inside." Over cups of tea, he recounted the entire ordeal, watching as her expression shifted from shock to anger to sorrow. When he finished, she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You did everything right," she said firmly. "But we can't let this go unanswered. People need to know what happened, not just for you, but for everyone who might face something like this in the future." Her words resonated deeply with Caldwell. He realized that while the night had been traumatic, it also presented an opportunity, a chance to shine a light on the injustices faced by countless individuals every day. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could use his platform to advocate for meaningful reform. And so, as dawn broke over the horizon, casting golden light across the quiet neighborhood, Caldwell began formulating a plan. This wasn't the end of the road. It was the beginning of a fight that needed to be fought, not just for himself but for society as a whole. The days following the incident were a whirlwind for Lieutenant General Marcus Caldwell. News of the confrontation spread quickly, fueled by the videos recorded by witnesses and shared across social media platforms. By morning, hashtags like "Justice for Caldwell" and "Ryan Accountability" now began trending nationwide, drawing attention not only to his personal ordeal, but also to the larger issue of systemic racism within law enforcement. Journalists scrambled to piece together the story, reaching out to Caldwell, witnesses, and local authorities for statements. The small-town traffic stop had suddenly become a national conversation. At first, Caldwell felt overwhelmed by the sudden spotlight. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls, texts, and emails from reporters, activists, colleagues, and even strangers offering support or demanding action. Some messages were heartfelt, thanking him for his courage and resilience. Others were harsh, accusing him of exaggerating the incident or using it as a way to gain sympathy. Despite the mixed reactions, Caldwell remained focused. He knew this wasn't about him anymore. It was about shining a light on the cracks in the system that allowed such behavior to persist. By the second day, the pressure mounted on local officials to address the situation publicly. The police department issued a brief statement acknowledging the incident and confirming that Officer Ryan Hargrove had been placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation. However, the vague language of the statement did little to quell public outrage. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "No justice, no peace," and chanting slogans calling for accountability. Community leaders, Civil rights organizations and advocacy groups joined forces, organizing rallies and town hall meetings to discuss the broader implications of the case. Amidst the growing chaos, Caldwell decided it was time to speak directly to the public. He held a press conference at a local community center, flanked by his wife, legal representatives, and several prominent civil rights activists who had offered their support. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as Caldwell stepped up to the podium. For a moment, he simply stood there surveying the crowd, his expression a mix of determination and exhaustion. Then he began to speak. "Good afternoon," he said, his deep voice commanding attention. "My name is Lieutenant General Marcus Caldwell, and I never imagined I'd be standing here today under these circumstances." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "What happened to me 2 nights ago was not an isolated incident. It is part of a pattern of prejudice, fear, and abuse of power that has plagued our society for far too long." As he recounted the events of that night, Caldwell's tone remained steady, though the emotion behind his words was undeniable. He described the escalating tension, the insults hurled at him, and the moment when Officer Hargrove drew his weapon. "I am a decorated military officer, a husband, a father, and a human being," he said, his voice rising slightly. But none of those identities mattered to him. All he saw was my skin color, and that alone was enough to justify treating me as less than human. The room fell silent as Caldwell's words hung in the air. When he finished, the audience erupted into applause, some people rising to their feet. Reporters fired questions at him, but Caldwell maintained his composure, answering each one thoughtfully. He emphasized that his goal wasn't revenge or retribution. It was accountability and change. "This isn't about one bad apple," he explained. "It's about addressing the rot in the barrel. We need systemic reforms, better training, and stronger oversight to ensure that no one else has to endure what I went through." The press conference struck a chord with viewers across the country. Clips of Caldwell's speech dominated news broadcasts and online forums, sparking debates about racial profiling, police misconduct, and the urgent need for reform. Politicians weighed in, with some pledging support for legislative changes, while others dismissed the incident as an anomaly. Celebrities and influencers used their platforms to amplify Caldwell's message, urging their followers to demand justice and hold institutions accountable. Meanwhile, the investigation into Officer Hargrove intensified. Body cam footage from the patrol car confirmed Caldwell's account, showing the officer's aggressive behavior and inflammatory remarks. Witness testimonies painted a damning picture of a man whose actions were driven by bias rather than protocol. Within 48 hours of the press conference, the police department announced that Hargrove had been terminated immediately. In a strongly worded statement, the chief of police condemned the officer's conduct, stating that it violated every standard of professionalism and integrity expected of law enforcement personnel. While many celebrated the swift decision, others pointed out that firing Hargrove was only the first step. Activists argued that true accountability required more than just removing one individual. It meant implementing policies to prevent similar incidents in the future. Caldwell agreed wholeheartedly. During interviews and appearances in the days that followed, he repeatedly called for comprehensive reforms, including mandatory implicit bias training, independent review boards to investigate complaints against officers, and stricter penalties for misconduct. Despite the progress, Caldwell faced backlash from certain quarters. Online trolls targeted him with hateful comments, questioning his credibility and accusing him of orchestrating the entire incident for publicity. Some even harassed his family, forcing them to increase security measures around their home. But Caldwell refused to let the negativity deter him. Instead, he leaned on the overwhelming support he received from allies and admirers. Letters poured in from people sharing their own experiences of discrimination and expressing gratitude for his willingness to speak out. One particularly moving letter came from a young soldier stationed overseas. "Sir," the note read, "your courage inspires me to keep fighting, not just for my country but for equality and justice. Thank you for showing us that we can stand tall even when the odds are stacked against us." These moments of connection reinforced Caldwell's resolve. He realized that his voice carried weight because of his position and accomplishments, but also because of his vulnerability. By sharing his story openly, he gave others permission to do the same. Together they formed a chorus of voices demanding change, a movement rooted in hope rather than despair. As the week drew to a close, Caldwell reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. What began as a terrifying encounter had transformed into a catalyst for national dialogue. Though the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about seeking justice for himself. It was about building a better, fairer world for generations to come. And for the first time since that fateful night, Caldwell allowed himself to believe that change was possible. In the weeks following the incident, Lieutenant General Marcus Caldwell found himself at the center of a national reckoning. The public outcry over his treatment had ignited a firestorm of discussions about systemic racism, police accountability, and the need for meaningful reform. While some viewed him as a symbol of resilience and courage, others saw him as a lightning rod for controversy. Despite the mixed reactions, Caldwell remained steadfast in his mission to turn this painful chapter into an opportunity for lasting change. The emotional toll of the ordeal was undeniable. At night, when the house grew quiet, Caldwell often found himself replaying the events in his mind. The sound of Officer Hargrove's voice, the cold steel of the gun pointed at him, and the weight of the crowd's stares lingered like ghosts. He knew he couldn't let those memories consume him, but they served as a constant reminder of why his advocacy mattered. His wife, Sarah, noticed the toll it took on him, how his usually calm demeanor sometimes cracked under the pressure, and she urged him to seek support. "You don't have to carry this alone," she told him one evening as they sat together on the porch. "There are people who want to help." Caldwell listened to her advice and reached out to a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. Talking through his feelings helped him process the fear and anger that still bubbled beneath the surface. It also gave him clarity. He realized that healing wasn't just about moving past the pain. It was about channeling it into something positive. With renewed determination, Caldwell threw himself into his advocacy work, partnering with organizations dedicated to criminal justice reform and civil rights. One of his first major initiatives was collaborating with a prominent nonprofit to launch a campaign called Voices for Change. The initiative aimed to amplify stories of individuals who had experienced racial profiling or police misconduct, giving them a platform to share their experiences and demand action. Caldwell traveled across the country, attending town halls, speaking at rallies and meeting with community leaders. Everywhere he went, he was met with overwhelming support, but also skepticism from those who doubted whether real change was possible. At a panel discussion in Chicago, Caldwell addressed this doubt head-on. "I know it feels like we've been fighting these battles for decades," he said, his voice resonating through the packed auditorium. "And you're right, we have. But every generation has its moment to push harder, to demand more. This is ours." The audience erupted into applause, many nodding in agreement. Afterward, dozens of people lined up to speak with him, sharing their own stories of injustice. A young woman named Jasmine approached him, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for telling your truth," she said softly. "Because of you, I feel like mine matters too." These interactions fueled Caldwell's commitment to keep pushing forward. He began working closely with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at addressing systemic issues within law enforcement. One proposed bill focused on creating independent oversight committees to investigate complaints against officers, ensuring that cases weren't handled internally where bias might influence outcomes. Another sought to mandate regular, implicit bias training for all law enforcement personnel, emphasizing the importance of cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Though progress was slow, Caldwell found solace in knowing that each small victory brought them closer to meaningful reform. Not everyone supported his efforts, however. As his profile grew, so did the backlash. Hate mail arrived almost daily, filled with venomous attacks questioning his character and motives. Some accused him of using the incident to further his career, while others dismissed his calls for reform. as unnecessary or extreme. Online trolls targeted his family, posting cruel comments on social media and even attempting to uncover personal information about his children. For a brief moment, Caldwell considered stepping back, fearing for the safety of those he loved most. But Sarah reminded him of something important. "They're attacking us because they're afraid," she said. "Afraid of what you represent, hope, resilience, and the possibility of change." With her encouragement, Caldwell doubled down on his efforts. He hired a security team to protect his family and worked closely with his legal advisors to address the threats. More importantly, he refused to let fear dictate his actions. Instead, he leaned on the outpouring of support he received from allies around the world. Celebrities, politicians, and everyday citizens rallied behind him, using their platforms to amplify his message. Hashtags like Stand with Caldwell and Reform Now continued to trend, keeping the conversation alive and pressuring officials to act. As the months passed, Caldwell's advocacy began to yield tangible results. Several cities implemented pilot programs based on the reforms he championed, including body camera mandates and community policing initiatives. Lawmakers introduced federal legislation inspired by his proposals, sparking debates on Capitol Hill about the future of law enforcement in America. Caldwell testified before Congress, sharing his story and urging legislators to prioritize justice and equality. His testimony moved many to tears, with one senator calling it a wake-up call for our nation. Despite these victories, Caldwell understood that the fight was far from over. Systemic change required patience, persistence, and unity, qualities he embodied in everything he did. He continued to speak out, not just about policing, but about broader issues of inequality in education, healthcare, and economic opportunity. By addressing the root causes of discrimination, he believed society could create a foundation for true equity. One of the most rewarding aspects of his journey was connecting with young people. Caldwell visited schools and youth organizations, encouraging students to use their voices to advocate for change. "Your generation has the power to reshape the world," he told a group of high schoolers during a virtual Q&A session. "Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Speak up, stand firm, and never stop believing in the possibility of a better tomorrow." The students listened intently, their eyes wide with admiration. Many reached out afterward to thank him, saying his words had inspired them to get involved in activism. Through it all, Caldwell never lost sight of his ultimate goal, creating a world where no one had to endure what he had. He carried the scars of that night with him, not as burdens but as reminders of why the fight mattered. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly be long and difficult, he faced it with unwavering hope. Because in the end, Caldwell knew that change didn't happen overnight. It happened step by step, person by person, until the collective effort became unstoppable. By the time autumn rolled around, Caldwell felt a renewed sense of purpose. The movement he had helped spark was gaining momentum, driven by countless individuals committed to building a fairer, more just society. Though challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. Not just as a lieutenant general or a survivor, but as a beacon of hope for anyone who dared to dream of a brighter future. Months after the incident that changed his life forever, Lieutenant General Marcus Caldwell began to see glimpses of progress in places he hadn't expected. The small-town traffic stop had snowballed into a nationwide movement, sparking conversations and actions that reached far beyond what Caldwell could have imagined. As winter approached, the city where the altercation occurred became one of the first to implement sweeping reforms aimed at addressing systemic racism within its police force. These changes included mandatory implicit bias training, stricter accountability measures for officers, and the creation of an independent review board to oversee misconduct cases. It was a victory, not just for Caldwell, but for everyone who had fought tirelessly alongside him. The impact of Caldwell's advocacy extended beyond policy changes. It also reshaped how people thought about justice and equality. His story inspired countless individuals to speak out against injustice, whether through protests, petitions, or personal acts of courage. In classrooms, community centers, and living Rooms across the country, people were having difficult yet necessary conversations about race, power, and privilege. Young activists emerged, emboldened by Caldwell's example, organizing grassroots campaigns and demanding transparency from their local governments. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Be the Change and Accountability Matters, keeping the momentum alive. One particularly poignant moment came when Caldwell returned to testify before Congress once again. This time he wasn't alone. A diverse group of citizens joined him, teachers, nurses, students, and even former law enforcement officers, all sharing their experiences of racial profiling and police misconduct. Their stories painted a vivid picture of the challenges faced by marginalized communities, reinforcing the urgent need for reform. As Caldwell listened to their testimonies, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. "This isn't my fight alone," he said during his closing remarks. "It's ours. And together we can build a future where no one has to fear being treated unfairly because of the color of their skin." His words resonated deeply, earning standing ovations and widespread media coverage. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle acknowledged the importance of the issue, pledging to work toward bipartisan solutions. While political gridlock often slowed progress, Caldwell remained optimistic. He knew change took time, and every step forward, no matter how small, was worth celebrating. Back home, Caldwell continued to balance his role as an advocate with his responsibilities as a husband, father, and military leader. His family had become accustomed to the spotlight, though they still prioritized privacy whenever possible. Sarah often joked that their dining table doubled as a strategy room, cluttered with notes, laptops, and half-empty coffee cups as they planned upcoming projects. Their children, now more aware of their father's efforts, expressed pride in his work. "Dad's making the world better," his youngest daughter told her teacher during a class discussion about heroes. Caldwell chuckled when he heard the story, touched by her innocent perspective. Despite the praise and recognition, Caldwell never lost sight of humility. He frequently reminded himself and others that he was simply one person doing his part. "I didn't choose this path," he often said during interviews. "It chose me. All I'm trying to do is honor the lessons I've learned and make sure no one else has to go through what I did." His authenticity endeared him to supporters, who admired not only his resilience, but also his willingness to admit vulnerability. As spring arrived, signs of hope bloomed everywhere. Cities across the nation followed the lead of Caldwell's hometown, implementing similar reforms tailored to their unique needs. Police departments began partnering with community organizations to foster trust and collaboration. Training programs emphasized empathy and de-escalation, teaching officers to approach situations with understanding rather than aggression. Though critics argued that these measures weren't enough, Caldwell viewed them as critical first steps toward lasting transformation. In addition to institutional changes, Caldwell focused on empowering individuals to drive progress at the grassroots level. He launched a mentorship program called Pathways to Justice, connecting young activists with experienced leaders in civil rights and advocacy. Through workshops, seminars, and networking events, participants gained the tools and confidence needed to effect change in their own communities. One participant, a college student named Jamal, credited the program with helping him organize a successful campaign to reform his campus security policies. "General Caldwell taught us that leadership isn't about titles, it's about action," Jamal said during a panel discussion. "He showed us that anyone can make a difference if they're willing to try." Caldwell's influence also reached international audiences. Invitations poured in from countries grappling with similar issues, eager to learn from his experiences. He traveled abroad to share his insights, participating in global forums and collaborating with human rights organizations. His message transcended borders. Justice and equality were universal aspirations, achievable through unity and perseverance. By summer, Caldwell's story had come full circle. The gas station where the incident occurred erected a plaque commemorating the event, honoring Caldwell's bravery and acknowledging the broader struggle for racial justice. On the anniversary of the confrontation, Caldwell visited the site with his family and a group of supporters. Standing beneath the warm sunlight, he reflected on how much had changed, and how much work still lay ahead. "This moment reminds me why we can't give up," he said, addressing the crowd gathered there. "Every challenge we face is an opportunity to grow stronger, to build bridges, and to create a legacy of compassion and fairness." The plaque read, "Here stood Lieutenant General Marcus Caldwell, whose courage ignited a movement for justice and equality. May his story inspire us all to stand firm in the pursuit of a better tomorrow." Though the scars of that night would always remain, Caldwell found peace in knowing that something meaningful had emerged from the pain. He had transformed a moment of fear into a catalyst for hope, proving that even in the darkest times, light could prevail. As he walked away from the gas station that day, surrounded by loved ones and allies, Caldwell felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The road to true justice might be long and winding, but with each step forward, he knew they were closer to a world where everyone could live with dignity, respect, and freedom. And so, Lieutenant General Marcus Caldwell's journey continued, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a symbol of resilience and possibility. His story served as a reminder that while the fight for equality required patience, persistence, and courage, it was a fight worth waging. For in the end, it wasn't just about changing laws or systems, it was about changing hearts and minds. And that, Caldwell believed, was the most powerful legacy of all,